We like to think survival instincts are hardwired into human DNA. Then we look at Florida. Today we document 6 cases where absolute confidence collided with the unforgiving laws of physics. This is a clinical analysis of fatal human error. Do not attempt to bypass safety protocols. Watch closely as common sense is violently overruled by gravity, torque, and sheer impatience. March 14, 2010. The humid spring air smelled of fresh dirt and cut grass in a quiet Jacksonville, Florida suburb. A heavy-duty Ford F-250 pickup truck idled in a residential driveway. The deep vibration of its diesel engine rattled the loose metal tools in the truck bed. 42-year-old Robert Vance wiped the cold sweat from his face. He had just spent 3 hours mowing a massive 2-acre lawn. He was exhausted. His only goal was to load his heavy riding mower and drive home. This completely normal human fatigue bred a highly dangerous impatience. The pickup had a lifted suspension. Its heavy metal tailgate sat exactly 34 inches above the hard black asphalt. The standard safety rule for this exact task is absolute. You must use arched, heavy-duty aluminum ramps secured with steel chains. Robert did not have his safety ramps today. He had left them locked inside his home garage. Instead of wasting 40 minutes driving back to get them, he looked around the yard. He found 2 old weathered pieces of lumber leaning against a wooden shed. They were standard 2x8 pine boards. The wood was bleached pale gray by the sun. Damp green moss grew along the splintered bottom edges. Years of absorbing winter rain and baking in the summer heat had quietly ruined the internal fibers. The wood was secretly rotting from the inside out. Robert casually placed the thick boards against the edge of the tailgate. He climbed onto the black vinyl seat of the mower. He turned the metal key, and the gas engine roared to life. He steered the heavy green machine toward the wooden planks. This is where human intuition fatally misunderstands the strict laws of physics. A thick piece of wood might easily support a resting, static weight. If you gently placed the 650-pound mower in the dead center of the boards, they would flex but likely hold. However, Robert was driving the machine forward up a steep angle. This introduced the deadly invisible factor of dynamic load. When the large rubber rear wheels grip a surface to push a heavy machine uphill, they apply immense rotational force. Engineers call this torque. Torque radically multiplies the downward physical stress on the supporting material. Furthermore, as the mower slowly drove up the steep incline, its center of gravity drastically shifted backward. All the massive weight of the rear-mounted engine transferred to the back tires. Robert carefully steered the front wheels onto the wooden boards. The thin pine groaned loudly under the pressure. The front wheels successfully reached the metal edge of the truck tailgate. The mower was now angled upward at a treacherous 45-degree pitch. Gravity pulled hard against his spine. He pressed the metal drive pedal to bring the heavy rear wheels up. The deep rubber treads gripped the dead center of the rotting wooden boards. The engine RPM spiked sharply. The rear wheels dug in and applied sudden, violent torque directly to the weakest point of the wood. The compromised cellular structure of the rotting pine instantly failed. A sharp, explosive crack echoed through the neighborhood like a gunshot. The left board snapped completely in half. Time dilated into a terrifying sequence of microseconds. The sudden loss of structural support on the left side sent a massive kinetic shockwave through the machine. The right board instantly buckled and shattered under the heavily doubled weight. The heavy mower dropped violently downward. Because of the extremely steep upward angle and the heavy rear engine, gravitational equilibrium was completely lost. The machine did not merely fall straight down. It pivoted aggressively backward. Robert immediately lost his tight grip on the plastic steering wheel. He fell backward through the empty air, striking the hard asphalt flat on his back. Less than half a second later, the 650-pound wall of steel, plastic, and engine block followed him. The lawnmower flipped completely upside down in the air. It slammed directly across his highly exposed chest. The mechanical consequences were brutal, immediate, and clinically absolute. The immense, concentrated blunt force trauma was catastrophic. The dead weight of the engine block instantly collapsed the human chest cavity. The rib cage suffered massive and total structural failure. The sheer physical compression forced all the oxygen violently from his lungs. The extreme, sustained pressure on the thoracic cavity caused irreversible internal damage to vital organs. The extreme internal compression caused an immediate halt in blood circulation. Cardiac arrest was instantaneous. The sheer physics of the crushing impact left zero chance for any emergency medical intervention. The quiet suburban street quickly fell silent once again. The heavy-duty diesel truck continued to idle smoothly in the driveway. The crushed, splintered pieces of gray, rotting pine lay scattered across the black pavement. The overturned green lawnmower rested heavily on the asphalt. Sharp fumes of gasoline slowly leaked from its inverted fuel tank, creating a shimmering puddle. One black rubber wheel hung high in the air, spinning uselessly and silently in the gentle spring breeze. It was a cold, quiet testament to the invisible, unforgiving rules of dynamic force. March 22, 2012. A massive, heavy-duty yellow diesel tractor sat idling in a rural driveway outside Orlando, Florida. Its complex hydraulic system was designed strictly for lifting tons of dense earth, not for what 55-year-old Arthur Miller was about to attempt. A small stray cat had been stranded near the top of a towering oak tree for 2 days. Arthur was a highly resourceful neighbor who felt immense confidence in his mechanical skills. To reach the animal, he needed serious elevation. He drove the tractor directly under the thick branches. A piece of heavy machinery like this is never designed to serve as a mobile, elevated scaffolding system. Yet human overconfidence routinely ignores the strict mathematical boundaries of mechanical design. Arthur engaged the steel hydraulic levers inside the cab. He raised the wide metal bucket to its absolute maximum vertical height. The heavy steel bucket now hovered a full 12 feet in the air. This was the very first fatal error in physical geometry. Arthur then grabbed a standard 20-foot aluminum extension ladder. He placed the metal legs directly inside the elevated metal bucket. He leaned the top rung of the ladder against the rough, gray bark of the tree. The fundamental rule of basic ladder safety requires a flat, solid, completely immovable surface to anchor the feet. Arthur placed his ladder onto heavily curved, smoothly polished, slippery steel. The exact mechanism of the impending failure was deeply rooted in a physical concept called the center of mass. A heavy tractor bucket is supported entirely by hydraulic fluid running through thick rubber hoses. This closed system is incredibly strong, but it is never perfectly rigid. It always contains a microscopic amount of mechanical play and sway. When suspended high in the air, the heavy bucket acts exactly like a stiff pendulum. Placing a tall, slender ladder inside it creates an incredibly unstable, highly stacked center of gravity. Any slight lateral movement at the very top of the ladder heavily multiplies into severe leverage at the bottom base. Arthur confidently climbed into the cold metal bucket. He began to slowly ascend the thin aluminum rungs without a safety harness. The cold morning wind blew gently against his heavy canvas jacket. He climbed higher, eventually reaching 25 feet above the hard, unforgiving black asphalt road. He stood near the absolute top, balancing delicately on the narrow metal step. He stretched his right arm outward to grab the shivering animal. This minor, seemingly harmless shift in human weight drastically altered the highly precarious balance. The entire center of mass suddenly leaned too far sideways. The hard rubber feet of the aluminum ladder slipped a quarter of an inch across the smooth steel floor. This microscopic, almost invisible slip sent a sudden, sharp kinetic jolt downward. The jolt traveled directly into the tractor's raised hydraulic arms. The pressurized internal fluid briefly compressed under the shock and then violently rebounded. The entire heavy metal bucket twitched with a deep, echoing, metallic groan. It was only a tiny fleeting vibration, but it was mathematically enough. The ladder's fragile base completely lost all static friction. The aluminum legs kicked out aggressively from inside the slippery bucket. Time instantly warped and dramatically slowed to a dreadful crawl. Arthur desperately grabbed at the rough oak bark, but his thick leather work gloves slipped. The tall ladder rapidly tipped backward into the empty, cold sky. He experienced a brief, terrifying moment of total weightlessness. Gravity then seized absolute control of the situation. The long free fall was a silent, unalterable, and brutal physics equation. The human body accelerates downward at exactly 32 feet per second squared. Arthur plummeted straight toward the unyielding black asphalt. The terminal impact was mechanically violent and totally unforgiving. The delicate human skeleton simply cannot absorb that massive level of sudden deceleration energy. He struck the solid pavement hard on his side. The blunt force trauma was completely instant and entirely catastrophic. The extreme kinetic energy transfer immediately collapsed the rib cage and caused catastrophic failure of the pelvic girdle. The skull suffered a massive, irrecoverable structural failure upon making direct, violent contact with the hard road surface. This extreme cranial trauma instantly disrupted all vital neurological pathways. Total loss of consciousness was immediate and irreversible. Brainstem function ceased at the exact fractional moment of impact. The human cardiovascular system shut down completely just seconds later. It was a cold, highly clinical conclusion to a very warm-hearted, innocent intention. High above the tragic scene, the stray cat remained safely perched in the rustling green oak leaves. Down below, the massive yellow tractor sat perfectly still on the asphalt. Its empty metal bucket remained suspended high against the pale gray clouds, held firmly by the rigid hydraulic lines. The long aluminum ladder lay severely twisted on the ground. Its hollow metal frame loudly echoed a dull metallic ringing sound before finally fading into total, heavy silence. March 18, 2009, 48-year-old David Harris considered himself a highly capable homeowner, clinging confidently to the rough bark of a towering royal palm in Miami, Florida. He wanted to remove a massive dying section of the tree himself to save the high cost of hiring a professional arborist. The humid air vibrated with the aggressive scream of his heavy orange chainsaw. He had purchased a heavy-duty climbing harness, complete with thick nylon webbing and steel carabiners. He understood the basic concept of working at elevation. You must physically attach your body to a stationary object to survive. However, physical fatigue and sweltering heat can easily blur the line between a secure anchor and a fatal mistake. The strict safety protocol for tree trimming dictates an absolute rule. A safety lanyard must always be secured around the main, immovable trunk. It must be positioned high above the intended cut line. This simple geometry ensures that whatever falls below you falls entirely alone. David was sweating heavily. The heavy orange chainsaw was exhausting to hold sideways for extended periods. He positioned his body to make the final cut on a 200-pound dead palm section. To get a better angle, he needed to adjust his primary safety strap. In a momentary lapse of spatial awareness, he unclipped his steel carabiner from the main trunk. He blindly reached around the tree. He reattached the locking metal clip directly around the thick base of the exact same branch he was preparing to sever. He had inadvertently tied his own life directly to a falling object. The mechanical reality of this error is entirely brutal. A safety line does not magically negate gravity. It merely transfers a human's weight to an anchor point. If the anchor point enters free fall, the human is violently dragged down with it. Unaware of the lethal trap he had just set, David squeezed the throttle trigger. The spinning steel chain bit aggressively into the damp fibers of the palm. Sawdust sprayed wildly into the wind. The engine roared loudly as it chewed through the final inches of the dense plant tissue. With a loud, tearing crack, the structural integrity of the massive palm section completely failed. The heavy chunk of wood detached from the main trunk and immediately dropped. Time brutally slowed to a crawl. For a fraction of a second, David felt a false sense of accomplishment. Then the heavy nylon safety strap violently snapped taut against his waist. The 200-pound mass of falling wood possessed immense kinetic energy. It acted exactly like a massive stone anchor. It aggressively yanked David forward. The force instantly ripped his steel climbing boots completely out of the soft tree bark. He was violently pulled into the empty, humid air. He plummeted downward from a height of 40 feet. He was inextricably tethered to the massive piece of dead wood falling right beside him. The acceleration of gravity was absolute. The catastrophic impact with the hard, sun-baked earth was mechanically unavoidable. The heavy piece of palm wood struck the ground first. David violently slammed into the soil a microsecond later. The extreme deceleration forces were strictly non-survivable. The massive kinetic energy transfer resulted in immediate, overwhelming blunt force trauma. The sudden impact caused massive structural failure of the pelvic girdle. It caused a massive, irrecoverable structural failure of the cervical spine. This severe cranial and spinal trauma instantly disrupted all major neurological pathways. It completely disconnected the brain from the central nervous system. Total loss of consciousness was immediate and permanent. The violent internal compression caused rapid cardiovascular collapse. This led directly to terminal cardiac arrest. There was absolutely zero physiological possibility for any medical intervention. The quiet suburban yard fell completely silent. The heavy orange chainsaw lay deeply embedded in the soft green grass. Its small engine quietly sputtered before finally running out of fuel. David remained perfectly still on the ground. The bright blue nylon safety strap remained securely attached to his waist harness. Its heavy steel carabiner was still tightly wrapped around the massive, dead piece of palm wood. The fallen branch rested silently right beside him in the quiet afternoon heat. May 12, 2014. A damp, overcast Monday morning draped over a quiet rural county in central Florida. The sandy local soil was deeply saturated from 3 consecutive days of heavy tropical rainfall. 61-year-old Thomas Wright sat atop his heavy-duty riding lawnmower. He was determined to finish his weekly yard work before the next storm arrived. His expansive property bordered a deep, concrete-lined agricultural drainage canal. The steep, sloping, grassy banks of the canal pitched downward at a severe 45-degree angle. At the bottom of this steep embankment flowed 3 feet of cold, dark, rapidly moving runoff water. Thomas was operating a massive 450-pound steel lawn tractor. There is a fundamental, non-negotiable safety protocol for operating any heavy machinery on a steep incline. The operator must always drive the machine straight up and directly down the hill. You must absolutely never drive horizontally, parallel to the slope. This is a strict matter of mechanical physics. A riding mower possesses a dangerously high center of gravity. The heavy iron engine block is mounted entirely above the axles. When you drive sideways across a steep hill, that massive weight shifts heavily toward the downhill tires. Thomas chose to ignore this critical rule. He wanted to save time by making long, continuous, horizontal passes along the edge of the water. He steered the heavy green machine onto the extreme 45-degree slope. The small gas engine labored heavily against the incline. The thick, wet grass blades were incredibly slippery. They acted precisely like a thick layer of organic grease between the rubber tires and the muddy soil. The physical coefficient of friction plummeted to near zero. Thomas leaned his upper body weight heavily uphill. He falsely believed his own small mass could counter the absolute physics of a 400-pound shifting iron block. As the machine rolled slowly forward, the wet, muddy ground suddenly gave way beneath the lower right rear tire. The sudden loss of traction broke the fragile equilibrium. The high center of mass instantly crossed the physical tipping point. Time warped into a terrifying, slow-motion cascade of mechanical failure. The massive steel machine violently rolled sideways. Thomas had absolutely no time to jump clear. The heavy tractor tumbled aggressively down the muddy embankment. It crashed directly into the cold, murky water of the drainage canal. Thomas plunged violently beneath the surface. He was heavily disoriented by the sudden shock of the cold water and the violent rotation. The massive 450-pound steel tractor landed completely upside down. It crashed directly on top of him. The heavy metal steering column firmly pinned his lower body against the soft mud at the bottom of the canal. In a desperate surge of adrenaline, Thomas frantically tried to slide his body backward to escape the crushing weight. This is where a tragic stroke of mechanical misfortune strictly sealed his fate. The thick fabric of his heavy denim work jacket wrapped tightly around the jagged steel edge of the mower's hydraulic control lever. A heavy metal bolt securely snagged the tough material. He was now mechanically tethered to the sunken, immovable iron anchor. The physical reality of the situation was absolute and highly unforgiving. He was trapped 2 feet beneath the opaque, muddy water. He was completely unable to reach the surface for a breath of vital oxygen. The biological consequences of this mechanical trap were strictly clinical. As he struggled against the unyielding steel, his rapidly beating heart quickly consumed the oxygen in his bloodstream. The intense physical panic drastically accelerated his metabolic rate. Within 90 seconds, the extreme buildup of carbon dioxide in his blood triggered an uncontrollable reflex to inhale. Cold, muddy water violently rushed into his human respiratory system. The sudden fluid intake immediately flooded the delicate alveoli within his lungs. This completely blocked any further oxygen exchange. Severe systemic hypoxia set in within moments. The absolute lack of oxygen to the brain caused a rapid and total loss of consciousness. Shortly after, the severe unrecoverable oxygen deprivation triggered terminal cardiac arrest. It was a completely silent, invisible conclusion beneath the dark surface. The quiet rural morning remained undisturbed. The heavy gray clouds slowly drifted across the wide sky. Down in the drainage canal, the dark muddy water smoothly flowed past the 4 black, rubber tires of the overturned lawnmower. They were now pointing silently up toward the overcast sky. A few freshly cut, bright green blades of grass slowly floated away on the gentle current. They left behind nothing but the cold, absolute certainty of physics. November 14, 2007. A standard 1,000-watt consumer microwave oven sat quietly on the laminate counter of a hunting cabin in the Florida Panhandle. It was a simple appliance designed strictly to heat water molecules, yet 45-year-old William Barrett was about to turn it into a lethal fragmentation bomb. He was deeply frustrated by the heavy morning rain. Tomorrow was the highly anticipated opening day of deer season. While unloading his truck, he had just dropped his plastic box of expensive rifle ammunition into a deep mud puddle. The heavy brass cartridges were soaking wet. William was a highly impatient man. He knew modern smokeless gunpowder must remain completely dry to ignite properly in the chamber. A patient hunter would carefully wipe the casings with a cotton towel and leave them near a warm heater overnight. William wanted a fast, modern solution. He walked over to the kitchen counter. He placed 6 heavy rifle cartridges directly onto the rotating glass plate of a standard kitchen microwave. He shut the plastic door until the latch clicked. He forcefully punched in a 2-minute cycle and hit start. This action was a fatal misunderstanding of basic electromagnetic physics. A microwave operates by bombarding the internal chamber with high-frequency radio waves. These invisible waves are designed to pass through glass and target water molecules to create heat. However, solid metal reflects these waves. When you put a highly conductive metal like thick brass inside, it acts as a powerful electrical resistor. The thin metal absorbs the rogue electromagnetic energy and rapidly converts it into extreme, concentrated thermal heat. William did not step away from the counter. He leaned his upper body forward. He placed his face just 3 inches from the protective wire mesh of the glass door. He wanted to visually monitor the drying process. Inside the bright chamber, the solid brass casings were rapidly heating up. The intense thermal energy transferred straight through the metal walls and directly into the tightly packed gunpowder. Gunpowder does not require a physical spark to ignite. It simply needs to reach an auto-ignition temperature of exactly 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Exactly 14 seconds into the cooking cycle, the internal temperature of the brass crossed that critical threshold. The solid powder inside all 6 tightly sealed cartridges detonated simultaneously. The rapid chemical reaction instantly converted the powder into expanding, superheated gas. Because the heavy lead bullets were firmly crimped into the tight brass necks, the gas had absolutely nowhere to go. The internal pressure spiked dramatically in a fraction of a second. The solid brass casings suffered a catastrophic structural failure. They violently exploded into dozens of sharp, jagged metal fragments. The microwave itself was a tightly sealed steel box. The massive overpressure wave instantly sought the weakest point of escape. That single weak point was the front glass door. The violent blast wave instantly sheared the heavy steel hinges. The heavy plastic door in the high-velocity brass shrapnel blew outward at hundreds of feet per second. William was standing entirely in the direct blast zone. The mechanical impact was mathematically unavoidable. The heavy door struck his head with massive kinetic energy, causing immediate, severe blunt force trauma. Simultaneously, the high-velocity brass shrapnel critically impacted his upper torso and lower neck area. The official coroner's report detailed catastrophic, non-survivable damage to the major vascular structures. The high-velocity metal fragments instantly compromised the carotid artery and the jugular vein. The resulting rapid loss of blood pressure caused an immediate, unrecoverable failure of the entire cardiovascular system. The brain was instantly starved of vital oxygen. This sudden physiological shock resulted in a total and irreversible loss of consciousness. Terminal cardiac arrest followed within mere seconds. The physiological damage was clinically absolute, leaving absolutely zero chance for emergency medical survival. The quiet kitchen was suddenly filled with the sharp, acidic smell of burnt sulfur and melting plastic. A thick cloud of gray smoke slowly drifted across the cracked ceiling. The microwave's internal glass plate had shattered into dust. However, the small digital timer on the broken electronic display continued to function perfectly. It glowed a bright neon green in the dark room. It silently counted down the remaining 1 minute and 46 seconds above the motionless figure lying on the cold linoleum floor. January 23, 2006. 32-year-old Marcus Thorne was dressed entirely in dark, heavy clothing, driven by a highly reckless criminal disregard for standard mechanical safety procedures. His objective on this freezing, moonless night at a poorly lit Florida boatyard was purely financial. He was attempting to steal a massive, highly expensive outboard boat motor from a parked fiberglass vessel. An outboard motor of this specific industrial grade is a dense, concentrated block of heavy iron and cast aluminum. It weighs exactly 550 pounds. In a professional marine workshop, safely removing this massive engine requires strict engineering protocols. A certified mechanic would use an electric overhead gantry crane and a specialized wooden support stand to catch the dead weight. Professional mechanics will absolutely never position their fragile bodies directly underneath a suspended, unsecured mass. Marcus had no overhead crane and no support stand. He was working in total darkness with nothing but a standard steel socket wrench. The large fishing boat was parked high on a dual-axle transport trailer. This specific setup left a very tight, 36-inch vertical gap between the heavy bottom of the engine and the freezing concrete pavement. Marcus decided to ignore the massive physical risks. He lay flat on his back on the icy ground. He slowly slid his body directly underneath the suspended engine block to reach the massive steel mounting bolts. The heavy motor was clamped tightly to the boat's vertical fiberglass transom, using 4 thick stainless steel bolts. This created a delicate mechanical equilibrium. As long as the metal threads of these heavy bolts were securely engaged with the locking nuts, immense physical tension counteracted gravity. The static friction generated by the tightened steel held the extreme weight in perfect balance. Marcus systematically placed his wrench on the bolts. He successfully removed the top 2 bolts in the dark. The massive engine did not shift a single millimeter. He then loosened and completely removed the lower left bolt. Still, the rigid metal bracket held completely firm against the fiberglass. This temporary stability falsely signaled to his human brain that the structure was safe. He incorrectly assumed the heavy engine was safely resting on the top edge of the boat. He falsely believed he could gently catch the engine once the last bolt was removed. However, the exact center of gravity for this specific internal combustion engine was located extremely high and leaned aggressively backward. It was pointing directly over his chest. Marcus confidently placed his cold steel wrench on the final remaining nut on the lower right side. He pulled hard against the metal handle. The nut slowly rotated. He was completely ignoring the fundamental, unforgiving laws of mass and gravity. He turned the socket wrench for the absolute final time. The last microscopic metallic ridge of the steel thread completely cleared the locking nut. In that exact fraction of a second, the mechanical equilibrium was permanently and violently broken. The entire holding force of the steel bolts instantly dropped to absolute zero. Gravity instantly asserted total dominance over the heavy iron mass. The 550-pound solid block detached entirely from the fiberglass transom. It did not slowly slide or gradually tilt backward. It simply plummeted straight down in a flawless, high-speed vertical drop. Marcus had absolutely 0 seconds to logically react or move out of the fatal trajectory. The heavy steel lower unit of the motor slammed directly into the absolute center of his unprotected chest. The official coroner's report documented an immediate, catastrophic, blunt force trauma. The delicate human skeletal structure is completely incapable of withstanding a sudden concentrated impact of over 500 pounds falling from 3 feet. The massive kinetic energy transfer caused a total, irrecoverable structural failure of the entire rib cage. The human sternum suffered complete structural collapse. The heavy iron engine block caused fatal, instantaneous compression of the thoracic cavity, leaving absolutely no physical room for the internal vital organs. This catastrophic internal pressure instantly halted all physiological cardiovascular function. The flow of oxygenated blood to the brain ceased immediately. The sudden, total lack of oxygen resulted in a complete and irreversible loss of consciousness within a mere fraction of a second. The extreme mechanical compression caused an immediate, terminal cardiac arrest. There was absolutely no physiological possibility for any emergency medical resuscitation. The cold, dark boatyard remained completely silent in the freezing night wind. The tall fiberglass boat sat perfectly still on its aluminum trailer, completely undisturbed by the violent drop below. The silver steel wrench lay quietly on the frozen concrete pavement. The massive, dark gray outboard motor rested extremely heavily on the ground. It permanently pinned the silent, motionless figure underneath its solid iron frame. A single drop of thick black motor oil slowly leaked from a freshly cracked metal housing. It dripped methodically onto the cold pavement, marking a permanent end to a fatal mechanical miscalculation. Physics remained undefeated. Like and subscribe if you value cold reality over comfortable illusions. Now I have a question. Which of these 6 men actually deserved his fate the most? Was it the microwave bomber or the boat motor thief? Drop your verdict in the comments. Don't give me fake sympathy. Give me your absolute, unfiltered judgment on human stupidity.